Hi, and thanks for tuning in to learn more about the effort to restore wolverines to Colorado. My name's Kaitie Schneider. I'm a Rockies and Plains program representative for Defenders of Wildlife based here in Colorado. And for over a year, I've been working with our partners at Colorado State University's Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence and CSU Extension to share what's been going on with the effort to restore wolverines. So let's dive in. Today, we're going to answer questions like, what is a wolverine? How is this decision made to reintroduce them? Why are they being restored to Colorado? What does this mean for Coloradans? How is CPW going to do it? And how you can get involved. And that's a lot to cover. So we better call in an expert, right? The Wolverine should know a lot about wolverines, right? Let's see what Hugh Jackman has to say.
Never heard of X-Men. I didn't know there was an animal called a wolverine. I thought it was like one of those Shazam. It's a made-up like comic book animal or something. And I came to set after studying wolves, and I had this whole physicality. And I was doing like a rehearsal, and the director goes, "What are you doing with your body, man?" And I said, "Oh, it's just thinking wolves. Like they're always smelling, and they're looking down because they're actually smelling the ground." And he goes, "Wolves? You're a wolverine?" I said, "Well, there's no such thing." And he goes, "Yeah, there is. Go to the zoo down the road, man."
Yikes, right? You're in good company if you've never heard of a wolverine before. So, we're going to start with wolverine biology and ecology. Let's look at their taxonomy, which tells us where wolverines fit in the animal kingdom. Wolverines are native to Colorado, and their scientific name is gulo gulo. And while many people think wolverines look a lot like bears, they actually belong to the weasel family Mustelidae. And so they're closely related to critters like badgers, otters, ferrets, martens, all of which we also have here in Colorado. Even though wolverines are the largest member of the weasel family on land, they're still pretty small. They grow to about 3 feet long and 15 inches tall, averaging about 20 to 40 pounds, and they can live up to 15 years in the wild. Imagine the size of a beagle or a corgi with longer legs. Wolverines spend most of their time in high elevations near or above timberline all year long. They prefer rugged, remote terrain like what we have here in Colorado, and each wolverine needs a large territory. And because of that, and because they're solitary animals, they defend those territories from other wolverines. Since they live alone and need those big territories, it's critical that wolverine populations have access to large areas of connected habitat. Wolverines are also specially adapted for these snowy and cold conditions. They have these large paws that you can see there on the screen that allow them to stay on top of deep snow, just like if you were wearing snowshoes. They also have claws that enable them to climb up and over steep cliffs and snow-covered peaks, like crampons, the metal spikes you attach to the bottom of your hiking shoes to help you grip the ice. Okay, let's talk about a wolverine's diet. Wolverines are primarily scavengers that eat carcasses of animals that were killed by other causes that come across in the forest. This makes a lot of sense when you think about how few options there are at such high elevations. In winter, they can even smell and dig up carcasses buried several feet below the snow. They also rely on what are called caches to get them through the winter. These are food stores that wolverines scatter throughout their territory during the year. You can think of caches as like having mini fridges all around your neighborhood stocked with your favorite snacks. Caches can be found buried in the ground, wedged in rocks, hidden in a hollow tree, or even in the chambers of their den. They have several hiding spots so that if another scavenger finds their cache, not all of their hard work is lost. In the summer, when they have more opportunities to actively hunt, forage, and store food in their caches, wolverines may prey on small mammals, birds, eggs, fish, and even plants. All right, so thinking about all of the wildlife that you've seen in Colorado that fits that description, what kinds of animals do you think wolverines might hunt in Colorado? I'll give you a second to think about it. If you said marmots, that is correct. That is definitely what we think their preferred prey is going to be here in Colorado. But there are also plenty of rabbits, squirrels, and other animals at such high elevation. All right, let's see a short video to watch wolverines finding food in action.
Like all mammals, he's warm-blooded. And to maintain his body temperature, He must eat a lot. But it's not easy to find food in this vast, empty wilderness. Wolverines have to travel up to 50 miles a day in search of it. He has an extremely sensitive nose. It's so sensitive, he can locate a carcass, even though it's frozen solid. A caribou that has been killed by the cold. Some of it he carries away. Surprisingly, perhaps, this male drops his food in the middle of nowhere and then leaves. And this is why. A female wolverine. The food is a gift for his mate. Wolverines are very secretive animals, and very few people have ever seen this caring behavior. Several days later, it becomes clear how important these deliveries of food have been. The female emerges from her den beneath the snow, and another head appears. Their 3-month-old kit. It was born and has been nurtured 2 meters below the surface. This may well be the first time it has seen the world above the snow. The kit is strong enough to accompany its mother, and they look for a meal together. Fatherly devotion helps wolverines to raise a family during this, the coldest time of the year.
Isn't that incredible? I've watched that video dozens of times and I genuinely never get tired of it. There we saw a mother wolverine and her baby in that video. So let's talk about reproduction. Wolverines are slow to reproduce, which means they typically have really small populations. They're mostly solitary animals with really large territories, and so they only seek each other out to mate during a short period in the summer. This means that even in healthy populations, it can be hard to find potential mates. Even though wolverines mate in the summer, they don't actually start growing the baby until around January. This is a process called delayed implantation. Bears also do this. Mothers give birth between February and April to a litter of 1 to 3 babies called kits. They give birth to their kits in dens tunneled deep in the snow, which is why snowpack is so critical for wolverines. They'll also use tree roots, boulders, and other parts of their environment to make a den. On top of how hard it is to find a mate, it's pretty much on top of the mothers to raise the kits and find enough food for them to eat. In harsh, snowy conditions, this can be really hard. That's why wolverines typically only give birth every other year. This also means that a female wolverine may only have 3 to 6 litters in her lifetime. Most often, wolverine mothers take almost full responsibility for raising kits. However, like we saw in that video, some wolverine fathers may take a more active role by helping protect and feed the kits. Wolverine kits stay with their mothers for about 1 to 2 years, learning how to find food and survive on their own. Okay, here's a trivia question for you. When wolverine kits are born, do you think they weigh as much as A, a loaf of bread, B, a deck of playing cards, C, a liter of soda, or D, a football? What do you think it is? I'll give you 1 second to figure it out. All right, if you guessed B, that is correct. When wolverines are born, they only weigh about 3 to 5 ounces, which is similar to a standard deck of playing cards. Now, you're probably wondering how wolverines compare to some of the wildlife we already have in the state. I know this graphic is a lot, so let me walk you through it. Badgers and black bears are often misidentified as wolverines. But as you can see, wolverines are a bit larger than badgers and a lot smaller than black bears. While black bears can look similar to wolverines when they are small cubs, they grow to be the heaviest animal on our chart by far. Badgers are also commonly mistaken for wolverines because they have that similar body shape and are both members of the weasel family. We also included Canada lynx and gray wolves as examples of species that have also been reintroduced to Colorado. These two are the only ones on this chart that only eat meat. All of the rest of these species here eat both meat and plants. I want to emphasize that while the diversity of wildlife here on this chart is important to the state as a whole, these animals don't actually all occur in the same place. Some have greater overlap than others, though. For example, the wolverine and the Canada lynx share very similar habitats in Colorado, whereas wolverines and badgers prefer nearly opposite habitats, despite being members of the same family. So, you may have seen some of these other animals before, but what happened to wolverines in Colorado? Well, wolverines are a native species that roamed Colorado's mountains until the early 1900s, when the US government led efforts to eliminate carnivores from across the West, using poisoning, trapping, and shooting on both public and private land. While wolverines were not high on their list of target species, they were often killed by eating poisoned carcasses because they're scavengers. They were also overtrapped for their warm, high value, and frost resistant fur. All of this led to wolverines being completely eradicated from the state by 1919, so over 100 years ago. Here's your next trivia question. How many wolverines do you think have been confirmed in Colorado since 1919? So since they were wiped out of the state. Do you think it's A, 1, B, 7, C, 19, or D, 32 animals? I'll give you a second to think about it. What do you think? If you guessed A, that is correct. We only know of one wolverine that's made it to Colorado since 1919. That wolverine was named M56, a lone male that traveled 500 miles from near Grand Teton National Park all the way down into north central Colorado in 2009. You may remember the news headlines that followed M56 in his journey. Because he had a tracking collar, researchers were able to follow and share his movements. He stayed in Colorado for about 3 years before traveling back north, potentially in search of a mate. And so now that we know more about wolverines, let's talk about how the decision was made to reintroduce them. First, expert biologists and decision makers at both the state and federal level decided that wolverines needed a little extra support and protection. In 2023, after decades of legal back and forth, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designated wolverines as federally threatened with extinction in the lower 48 under the Endangered Species Act. Now, when it comes to Colorado, wolverines have actually been considered endangered in the state by CPW since 1973, way longer. Even though they were exterminated from the state, this made sure that any wolverines that did make it here would be protected. These extra protections are really important while wolverine populations are restored to sustainable levels in the lower 48. Now, this is not the first time there's been discussion about reintroducing wolverines. CPW started discussing the potential for wolverine reintroduction to Colorado in the 1990s. They even made plans to do so at the same time they reintroduced lynx in 2006, but decided to focus on one species at a time. In 2010, CPW revisited this discussion and even developed a draft management plan. At that point, CPW decided to put the effort on pause until the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided whether or not they would receive federal protections under the Endangered Species Act. In 2023, after the Fish and Wildlife Service published their decision to list wolverines as federally threatened, CPW resumed working on their plan to reintroduce wolverines to Colorado. So the decision stops there with CPW biologists, right? Well, not quite. In Colorado, we have a law that requires CPW to gain legislative approval before they can reintroduce a federally protected species. And there are two ways that they can get that legislative approval. One way is for lawmakers to pass a bill in the state legislative session, which happens every year, also known as representative democracy. Another way is through participatory democracy, where the public votes on an initiative on the state ballot. Either way, once legislative approval is secured, CPW drafts the technical aspects of a management plan, which they then submit to the CPW Commission for approval. The CPW Commission is an 11-member, governor-appointed citizen board tasked with establishing the rules and regulations for all state wildlife and parks. So, which route did they choose for wolverines? Wolverine reintroduction was decided by a bill through representative democracy. In the spring of 2024, Republican State Senator Perry Will and Democratic State Senator Dylan Roberts introduced a bipartisan bill to consider the state-led effort to restore wolverines. The bill, now called the Restoration of Wolverines Act, received broad public support by Democrats and Republicans, agencies like CPW, environmental organizations like Defenders, ski areas, and hunting groups. In fact, there was even greater support by lawmakers on the western slope compared to the eastern slope. The bill passed with flying colors and was signed into law by Governor Polis in 2024. The Restoration of Wolverines Act now does three key things. Obviously, authorize the CPW to restore wolverines, but there's two big things they need before they can get started. One, they need to obtain federal regulations known as a 10J rule with the Fish and Wildlife Service before they can begin. The bill also requires CPW to compensate producers for livestock losses, no matter how unlikely. These regulations for livestock compensation were introduced in January of 2026 and should be finalized in March of 2026 by the Commission. All right, now that we understand how the decision was made, let's talk about why wolverines are being restored to Colorado. Well, wolverines are a species of conservation concern for a few reasons. And Colorado has a unique opportunity to support their recovery. They just need a little help getting here. On this map, the darkest areas show us where wolverines could live in the lower 48 based on the habitat needs that we talked about earlier. This is really similar to where wolverines would have lived about 200 years ago. Our first issue is wolverines are currently absent from a lot of this historic habitat. Today, wolverines are only found in this top area circled in dark green, and the red circles show places where wolverines lived historically and where the habitat is still suitable today, but they've disappeared from those areas due to the hunting and trapping that we talked about earlier. You may have noticed that the largest area circled in red is here in western Colorado, where our mountains are. Another important concern is that wolverines in the lower 48 live in small, mostly disconnected populations. This is partly because wolverines are solitary and need those big home ranges and have those home ranges at these mountain peaks. But right now, scientists estimate that there are probably fewer than 350 wolverines in this area circled in dark green. And of those 350, only about 35 of them are probably breeding successfully. Wolverines in Alaska and Canada do have bigger populations, but they're just not really well connected to those in the lower 48. Small, isolated populations like this are especially vulnerable to disease and natural disasters. Our last big concern for wolverine conservation is that we're not entirely sure how this species will adapt to a warming or changing climate. This is a cold and snow adapted species facing a future with potentially a lot less cold and snow. Scientists are concerned that the areas where wolverines are currently found in the lower 48 won't be fit for this species in the coming decades. Snowpack is starting to melt earlier in the year in North America, so we're losing that deep snow females need to give birth and den in. Wolverines need that snow to remain in place through mid-spring to provide warmth and shelter for their kits. So now let's take a look at why Colorado is especially well suited to help address these concerns by restoring wolverines to our state. A reintroduction to Colorado would bring wolverines back to this largest area where they're historically present but currently absent, potentially creating a new stronghold for the species in the lower 48. And like we saw on this map, most of the wolverines in the lower 48 are confined and disconnected in the northern Rockies. But experts estimate that Colorado could support potentially a population of 100 wolverines one day. This would increase the population capacity in the lower 48 by at least 28%. That would be huge. Lastly, because of our high elevation, experts predict that our suitable wolverine habitat will stay snowier and colder longer than other regions where wolverines are currently found. Having more wolverines in more places helps ensure their survival if one of these areas becomes too warm for them or if a natural disaster occurs. So, if Colorado has such great habitat, Why haven't they returned on their own already? There are three big reasons why reintroduction is needed to restore a wolverine population in the southern Rockies. First, wolverines need help getting to Colorado because females don't typically disperse very far. Dispersal is when animals move away from where they're born to find new places to live, find food, and start families. This is how populations grow and move into new areas. However, because female wolverines don't disperse very far from where they're born, this limits how far and how fast wolverine populations can grow in new places. This is perhaps the biggest reason why a formal reintroduction effort is needed. This way, experts can bring in wolverines, particularly females who are unlikely to reach the state on their own, to reach and reestablish a population in some of the best remaining habitat we have left in the United States. Wolverines also have very slow population growth, which presents another challenge to the likelihood of them naturally establishing themselves here on their own. For one, females don't start reproducing until they're 3 or 4 years old, and even then, they only give birth to kits maybe every other year. So even if a female and a male were to make it to Colorado, the chances of them finding each other and creating enough offspring that could also survive to reproduce and start a population are really, really low. Finally, it's unlikely that enough wolverines can make it here on their own to ensure enough genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is important to all animals, and it means having a variety of traits in a population that help a species survive changes in their environment. When any species expands into a new area, genetic diversity is important because it helps the population stay healthy and adapt to changes like disease and climate change. Like I mentioned earlier, if a couple breeding pairs were able to form in Colorado on their own, the population would start from an extremely low level of genetic diversity, and that would just not set them up for long-term success. On the other hand, an organized reintroduction would allow CPW to establish a population with far greater genetic diversity. We were also interested in understanding how people feel about Wolverine reintroduction and what this means for Coloradans. So, to learn more, we reviewed the public comments shared during the hearings for the reintroduction bill in 2024, and we noticed some common themes: reasons people felt nervous and reasons they felt excited. And we want to share what we learned, starting with some of those concerns people expressed. For many, the idea of bringing back another species to Colorado's landscape can feel daunting, and that reaction is completely understandable. People are already navigating living with wolves, bears, mountain lions, and adding another species to the mix can raise some valid questions. We want to take the time to walk through some of the concerns that we heard, and we'll also talk about why these concerns matter and what the science says about how likely or unlikely some of these outcomes actually are. So let's dig in. Some Coloradans raised concerns about human safety. This is a common and reasonable question whenever a new species is being reintroduced. The good news is that wolverines pose little to no threat to people. They're solitary animals that prefer remote, high elevation areas and tend to avoid people altogether. In fact, there has never been a documented case of a wolverine attacking a person anywhere. That said, keeping human wildlife interactions safe really depends on us. Like with any wild animal, problems can arise if people approach, feed, or try to interact with them. Being respectful and responsible in the outdoors, giving animals space, never feeding or chasing them is the best way to protect both yourself and the wildlife we share the landscape with. Likewise, the best way to keep your pets safe is to keep them leashed or on strict voice control at all times. This allows you to move them out of the way if you encounter animals in the wild. We also know Coloradans love the mountains just as much as wolverines do. Outdoor recreation is a major part of life here. It drives the economy and draws people to live, work, and play in these landscapes. So it's understandable how some people have some questions about how wolverine reintroduction might affect recreation opportunities. During public testimony, we heard concerns about specific things like skiing, snowmobiling, and backcountry use. Similar to concerns about human safety, wolverines are unlikely to come into direct conflict or contact with recreationists. These animals are solitary, avoid people, and tend to live away from most developed or heavily used recreation areas. Because of these behaviors, experts don't expect wolverines to really interfere with recreation in a meaningful way. And furthermore, CPW doesn't expect wolverines to impact ski areas, trail systems, campgrounds, or your other favorite recreation areas. In fact, they might actually help one day. A few years ago, defenders led an effort up in the northern Rockies to have backcountry users help us collect data on wolverines that was super valuable to the science that we were able to do. Additionally, some ranchers, particularly those who raise sheep, have shared concerns about whether wolverines could pose a risk to their livestock. This concern is understandable. Returning another species to the landscape naturally raises questions for those whose livelihoods depend on domestic animals. That said, wolverine livestock conflicts are extremely rare. In the entire lower 48, officials have only ever documented two confirmed cases of wolverines preying on livestock. Both of those were sheep. Wolverines are relatively small bodied and typically scavenge on carcasses they find in the wild or hunt smaller wild prey. They tend to, again, avoid developed areas and human activity, which further reduces the chances of conflict. Plus, most ranchers in Colorado graze at much lower elevations than where wolverines will be found. Still, if a wolverine does cause livestock losses in Colorado, CPW will compensate the rancher. As we mentioned earlier, this was written directly into the bill that authorized wolverine reintroduction. Compensation is available regardless of how likely a conflict is, ensuring that ranchers are supported and concerns are taken seriously. Another concern some Coloradans shared is whether bringing back a protected species may impact the kinds of activities industries can do on public or private lands because of the possibility of additional regulations needed to protect them. Thankfully, much of the wolverine habitat in Colorado is already protected as national parks, forests, and wilderness areas. This makes it unlikely that the protection and restoration of wolverines will conflict much with other land uses in the state. That said, this is a concern that we in CPW are taking really seriously. CPW is working with federal agencies to minimize potential impacts and address these concerns. So stay tuned for more from them on this. All right, so far we've discussed some of the reasons why people are concerned and how those are being taken into consideration. Now, let's explore some of the reasons why people are excited about the return of wolverines to the state. First, some people think this initiative will position Colorado as a global leader in wildlife conservation once again. Because wolverine reintroduction has never been tried before, some hope that this will inspire wolverine restoration efforts in other areas. Some people are also really excited about the rare opportunity this creates for research. Wolverines are notoriously elusive. Because they live in remote, snowy environments and occur in such low numbers, they've been really difficult for scientists to study in the wild. A carefully managed reintroduction means researchers would be able to monitor these animals using tools like GPS collars, camera trap data, and long-term tracking. This could dramatically improve our understanding of wolverine behavior, movement, reproduction, habitat use, both in Colorado and across their range. Next, a lot of people expressed excitement about restoring a native species to help keep our ecosystems intact, healthy, and resilient. Wolverines play an important role as scavengers in this high alpine environment, and for many, bringing them back is a way to help ensure that Colorado's wild places remain strong and vibrant for future generations. Many also see the return of species that humans eliminated as righting a historic wrong, particularly in the case of wolverines, who are not known to typically prey on livestock or come into conflict with people, but were exterminated anyway. Finally, others shared how they value the existence of rare and remote species like the wolverine, even if they never get to directly interact with them. All right, let's move on to the portion I'm sure you are all dying to know. How the heck is CPW going to do this? So, like we mentioned earlier, CPW started developing this plan back in the early 2000s, and so a lot of our current plan is built upon these early efforts. CPW brought together a workshop of international experts in 2010 to advise them on the biological aspects of reintroduction and management. At the same time, they conducted an extensive public input process to collect feedback from key constituents, including recreation, agricultural, and conservation groups. New agency staff tasked with leading the program have spent the last couple years reviewing and updating this work and published their final Wolverine Restoration and Management Plan in January of 2026. An important piece of this plan is how many wolverines Colorado can actually support, and then how many need to be reintroduced to reach that goal. Researchers estimate that Colorado could potentially support about 100 wolverines one day. And so CPW aims to reintroduce a total of 45 animals over the course of 3 years. So up to 15 animals per year. And since female wolverines don't usually travel far from where they're born, CPW wants to initially focus on trying to bring down pregnant females. Another common question is, where will these wolverines come from? So while CPW hasn't begun discussing plans with other governments yet, biologists have developed a list of priority sources, and wolverines from Alberta and British Columbia, Canada, are at the top of that list. Canada's wolverine population is healthy, and their environment is very similar to Colorado, and that is exactly what we're looking for. In other words, biologists want individuals that are used to the kind of habitat, food sources, and natural predators that we have here. That gives animals the best chance of doing well once they're released. Additionally, CPW wants to make sure they're bringing in enough genetic diversity to help start that strong, healthy population like we discussed earlier. Now, let's talk about how wolverines will actually be captured and released. I know this is a key animal welfare question for a lot of folks. The plan is to capture wolverines in the winter between November and January and bring them to the Frisco Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. This center was actually designed to have enclosures that were fit for wolverines. While there, each animal will have time to adjust and get a health check by a veterinarian. They'll also be fitted with a GPS collar and a microchip for monitoring them in the wild. After this time to acclimate, CPW will release individuals near pre-made dens spaced throughout their release zones. What release zones, you may be thinking? Well, let's take a look. CPW has identified 3 general release zones for the wolverine reintroduction. Don't worry about squinting, we're going to zoom in a moment. Once they begin, they plan to release up to 15 wolverines each year for 3 years. They'll focus on one zone at a time to reach their goal of releasing 45 individuals total. These zones are based on habitat suitability, and those green spaces you see indicate Colorado's primary wolverine habitat. Within each zone, they've further divided the habitat into 300 square kilometer hexagons. While wolverines will eventually travel outside of these hexagons, this is just how biologists have mapped out how to space individuals within their habitat during this reintroduction phase. The exact release sites have not been selected yet, but CPW is going to be your best resource for detailed questions and updates about release locations. All right, now let's zoom in and take a closer look at these areas. The plan is to start by releasing wolverines in this central zone between Aspen and Gunnison. This location will help researchers observe how wolverines are going to initially respond to being released back into the wild. By choosing this central area, the heart of Colorado's wolverine habitat, officials hope to minimize the chance that animals can wander outside of the state. Next, they'll focus on this southern zone in the San Juan Mountains between Montrose and Durango. This is in the southwest corner of Colorado. And then finally, this northern zone in and around Rocky Mountain National Park. All right, so we're still quite a ways off from the start of the reintroduction. In addition to the state level policies, CPW began coordinating with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the federal regulations surrounding wolverine reintroduction in Colorado. That process will take a couple years to complete, and as they progress, there will be opportunities for people to submit feedback and comments that help the agencies create well-rounded policies. With that, the capture and release process probably won't begin until late 2027 at the very earliest. You can find CPW's full wolverine management plan on their website or scan this QR code. All right, so clearly there's a lot in the works. So let's talk about what you can do to get involved. Well, just by watching this, you can check attend a meeting off your list. If you want to help shape what wolverine management will look like in Colorado, you can comment on those upcoming federal regulations, and you can also provide thoughts and feedback to the CPW Commission as discussions around wolverines arise. Talking to your friends and family about wolverines, continuing to learn more, and sharing accurate information on social media is also incredibly important. And if you want more updates and opportunities for your area, be sure to check out defenders.org and sign up for our action alerts. If things come up that you can do to support wolverines, we'll be sure to let you know. All right, and that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much again for tuning in. If you have more questions about wolverine reintroduction to Colorado, please reach out to our Rockies and Plains office here at Defenders or Colorado Parks and Wildlife for more information. Until next time, thanks everyone.